You know what the problem with galactic politics is? Nobody ever reads the fine print. And by fine print, I mean the part where it says humans are basically walking disasters with opposable thumbs, and an alarming tendency to solve problems by hitting them really, really hard. Ambassador Zephyrix of the Crystalline Hegemony, yes, that's actually his name, and yes, he probably had pretentious parents, was about to learn this lesson the hard way. But let's back up a bit, shall we? Picture this. The year is 2387, and humanity has been part of the Galactic Council for exactly 43 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone's counting, except for the species keeping very careful track of how quickly humans had gone from new members to people you call when everything goes sideways. The Council itself is this sprawling bureaucratic nightmare that makes the old United Nations look like a model of efficiency. 17 different species, each more convinced of their own superiority than the last, all crammed into a space station the size of Manhattan and twice as pretentious. The Crystalline Hegemony, and seriously, who names these things, had been the undisputed masters of galactic diplomacy for about 3,000 years. They're these tall, elegant beings made of what looks like living quartz, who speak in harmonious tones and never ever lose their cool. Think of them as space elves, but shinier and with an even more insufferable sense of superiority. Their current problem was the Korvaxi Collective, a species of what can only be described as militant space crabs, who had decided that their corner of the galaxy wasn't quite big enough and maybe they should expand. By force. With really big guns. The situation is delicate, Ambassador Zephyrix explained to Director Harrison. Yes, a human was running the Council's diplomatic corps now, which should have been everyone's first clue that things were about to get interesting. The Korvaxi have surrounded the Tanari system. 3 billion lives hang in the balance. Director Harrison leaned back in his chair, which was probably worth more than most planets' GDP, and sighed. Let me guess. Traditional diplomatic channels have failed? The Korvaxi responded to our latest peace proposal by sending us a hologram of their war prime doing something anatomically impossible to a sculpture of our High Council. Charming. Harrison pulled up a holographic display that showed the tactical situation. It looked like a standard siege formation, except the standard part involved approximately 50,000 heavily armed warships. And you want to try one more diplomatic mission? The Council believes that face-to-face negotiations might succeed where remote communications have failed. Uh-huh. Harrison zoomed in on the Korvaxi fleet composition. And you volunteered for this suicide run because I am the finest diplomatic mind of my generation, Zephyrix said with the kind of humble confidence that only comes from 3 millennia of uncontested cultural superiority. Right, and you came to me because humans have a reputation for unconventional problem-solving. Now, this was the moment where a reasonable person might have politely declined. The Korvaxi weren't exactly known for their hospitality. Their idea of a diplomatic dinner party usually involved someone being literally dinner. But Director Harrison had been dealing with galactic politics for the better part of a decade, and he'd developed what psychologists like to call a highly functional form of cynicism. You want a human bodyguard? He said. The thought had occurred to us. Someone expendable. I prefer the term tactically flexible. Someone crazy enough to walk into a death trap with a smile on his face. Your species does seem to excel at that particular skill set. Harrison grinned. It wasn't a particularly nice grin. I know just the guy. Lieutenant Commander Alex Brick Morrison was, by most objective measures, exactly the wrong person for a delicate diplomatic mission. He stood 6 feet 4 inches in his socks, had shoulders that could double as a landing platform for small aircraft, and possessed what his commanding officers diplomatically referred to as an aggressive approach to conflict resolution. His service record read like a greatest hits album of military insanity. There was the time he'd single-handedly held off a Jandari raiding party, using nothing but harsh language and a broken chair leg. The incident where he'd talked a terrorist bomber into surrendering by explaining in graphic detail exactly what would happen to the bomber's reproductive organs if the bomb went off. And, most famously, the Battle of Kepler Station, where he'd ended a 3-day siege by the simple expedient of walking up to the enemy command ship and knocking on the airlock until they let him in to file a noise complaint. You want me to what now? Morrison asked when Harrison explained the situation. Diplomatic escort mission, very routine. To Korvaxi space. Technically, it's disputed territory, where they've been shooting anyone who gets too close. Only if you're not flying under a diplomatic flag. Morrison leaned forward in his chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. Director, with all due respect, are you completely out of your mind? Probably. Will you do it? Of course I'll do it. I was just checking to make sure we were all on the same page regarding the insanity level of this operation. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why humans are either the galaxy's greatest heroes or its most magnificent disasters, depending on your perspective. The diplomatic vessel Serene Harmony was exactly the kind of ship you'd expect the crystalline hegemony to build. Sleek, elegant, and probably worth more than the gross domestic product of several star systems. It was also, Morrison noted with professional interest, completely unarmed. No weapon systems? He asked Captain Solace, the ship's commander. She was a tall, graceful being whose crystal structure reflected light in a way that made her look like a living rainbow. Weapons would send the wrong message, she explained in that harmonious tone all crystallines used. We are beings of peace. And if someone shoots at us, our shields are quite advanced. How advanced? They should protect us from most standard weapons. Should. We have never had occasion to test them under combat conditions. Morrison stared at her for a long moment. Captain, let me see if I understand this correctly. We're flying into a war zone, in an unarmed ship with untested defenses, to negotiate with a species that considers diplomacy a form of foreplay. That is not inaccurate. And you see nothing wrong with this plan? The ambassador is very confident in his abilities. Right. Morrison hefted his gear bag, which contained enough weapons to outfit a small army and several items that technically violated at least 3 interstellar treaties. Well, this should be educational. The journey to the Tanari system took 18 hours, during which Morrison had the distinct pleasure of watching Ambassador Zephyrix prepare for what he clearly believed would be the diplomatic triumph of his career. The ambassador spent most of the trip reviewing his notes, practicing his opening statements, and generally behaving like someone who had never met a Korvaxi in person. You've dealt with them before, right? Morrison asked during one of their planning sessions. Extensively. I have studied their culture for decades. Studied how? Academic texts, historical records, cultural analyses, and face-to-face contact? Well, no, but I am thoroughly versed in their social customs and negotiation traditions. Morrison nodded slowly. Ambassador, let me share a little wisdom I picked up during my military career. There's a difference between reading about something and actually doing it. Kind of like the difference between reading about getting punched in the face and actually getting punched in the face. I fail to see the relevance of your analogy. You will. The Korvaxi blockade of the Tanari system was, Morrison had to admit, genuinely impressive. 50,000 warships arranged in a perfect sphere around the system's star, each one bristling with enough firepower to sterilize a planet. Their ships looked like someone had taken a crab, made it the size of a city, and then covered it with guns. Incoming transmission, Captain Solace announced as they approached the perimeter. The main screen flickered to life, revealing what could only be described as Morrison's worst nightmare given physical form. The Korvaxi War Prime was roughly the size of a small building, with exoskeleton plates that looked like they could stop a tank round and mandibles that could probably bite through starship hull plating. When he spoke, it was like listening to an avalanche with anger management issues. Unidentified vessel, you have entered Korvaxi territorial space. State your business or be destroyed. Ambassador Zephyrix stepped forward, his crystal structure shifting to what Morrison assumed was a diplomatic posture. Greetings, honored War Prime. I am Ambassador Zephyrix of the crystalline hegemony. I come under the ancient rights of diplomatic immunity to discuss terms for a peaceful resolution to this conflict. The War Prime's response was to make a sound that Morrison's universal translator helpfully rendered as derisive chittering mixed with homicidal intent. Crystalline. Your kind is weak. Your words are meaningless. Leave now or become nutrients for our young. Perhaps we could discuss this in person? Zephyrix suggested with the kind of optimism that would have been touching if it weren't so completely suicidal. I believe that face-to-face negotiations often yield better results than remote communications. More chittering. This time, Morrison was pretty sure the translator was just giving up and marking it as hostile laughter. You wish to come aboard our command vessel? If that would be acceptable, yes. Very well. We will prepare a reception for you. The transmission cut off, and Morrison immediately turned to Zephyrix. Ambassador, tell me you're not actually thinking about going over there. Of course I am. This is exactly the breakthrough we needed. That wasn't a diplomatic invitation, that was a dinner invitation, and we're the main course. Nonsense. The War Prime is clearly interested in genuine negotiations. Morrison looked at Captain Solace, who was studying her instruments with the kind of intense focus people usually reserved for defusing bombs. Captain, what's your read on their fleet positioning? They are repositioning their forces, she said carefully. Repositioning how? In what our tactical computer identifies as a standard execution formation. See? Morrison turned back to Zephyrix. Even their computers think we're about to die. You are both being unnecessarily pessimistic, Zephyrix said with the serene confidence of someone who had never been shot at by militant space crabs. I am quite confident that my diplomatic skills will prove adequate to the task. Morrison opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was really no point. He'd seen that look before, usually right before everything went spectacularly wrong. Instead, he hefted his gear bag and started checking his equipment. What are you doing? Zephyrix asked. Getting ready to keep you alive, Morrison replied, pulling out what looked like a standard sidearm, but was actually something considerably more destructive. Because diplomatic immunity doesn't mean much if you're dead. Violence will not be necessary. Ambassador, let me explain something about the universe. It has a really twisted sense of humor, and right now it's laughing at us. The Korvaxi command ship was exactly what Morrison had expected. A nightmare fusion of biological architecture and military engineering that looked like someone had crossed a crab with a battleship and then given it serious anger management issues. The docking bay alone was the size of a small city, filled with warriors who looked like they bench-pressed tanks for fun. Remember, Zephyrix said as they walked down the boarding ramp, we are here as peaceful diplomats. No aggressive actions. Define aggressive, Morrison muttered, scanning the reception committee. There had to be at least 200 Korvaxi warriors in the docking bay, and every single one of them was armed with weapons that could probably cut through starship armor. Anything involving violence. What about threats of violence? Absolutely not. Implications of potential future violence? No. Stern looks? Commander Morrison, please try to take this seriously. I am taking it seriously. That's why I'm asking about the stern looks. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of War Prime Craxus himself, who managed to make the other Korvaxi look small by comparison. He had to duck to fit through the doorway, and when he spoke, Morrison felt it in his bones. Welcome, Crystalline. I am War Prime Craxus, destroyer of worlds, crusher of enemies, bane of the weak. A pleasure to meet you, Zephyrix replied with perfect diplomatic courtesy. I am Ambassador Zephyrix, and this is my aide, Commander Morrison. Craxus's compound eyes swiveled to focus on Morrison, who had the distinct feeling he was being evaluated as potential prey. Human. That's right, Morrison said cheerfully. We're new to the neighborhood. Hope we're not causing any trouble. Humans! Yes, we have heard of your species. Small, weak, easily broken. You'd be surprised, Morrison replied, still smiling. Would I? And that, right there, was the moment when everything started to go sideways, because Morrison's smile changed. It went from polite and diplomatic to something that made several Korvaxi warriors instinctively step backward. Yeah, Morrison said. You really would. The thing about humans, and this is something the galaxy never quite figured out, is that they're absolutely terrible at knowing when they're outmatched. A reasonable species, faced with 200 heavily armed warriors, would immediately surrender. A practical species would at least try to negotiate. Humans, on the other hand, have this unfortunate tendency to size up the opposition and think, I wonder how many of them I can take down before they kill me. Morrison was running those calculations right now, and coming up with some surprisingly optimistic numbers. Shall we proceed to the negotiation chamber? Craxus asked, though his tone suggested that negotiation chamber was probably a euphemism for place where we eat you slowly. Certainly, Zephyrix replied. I look forward to a productive discussion. They were escorted through corridors that looked like they'd been carved from the inside of some massive creature, past guard stations where more warriors watched them with the kind of attention usually reserved for particularly interesting specimens. Morrison counted exits, weapon positions, and structural weak points out of pure habit. Stop that, Zephyrix whispered. Stop what? Whatever it is you're doing, you look like you're planning something violent. I'm always planning something violent. It's called being prepared. This is a diplomatic mission, and I'm providing security for the diplomat. That's literally my job. The negotiation chamber turned out to be a vast arena with seating for what looked like several thousand spectators. Most of those seats were occupied by Korvaxi warriors who were making sounds that Morrison's translator was rendering as bloodthirsty anticipation. Popular event, Morrison observed. Indeed, Craxus agreed. It has been some time since we have had proper entertainment. That was when Ambassador Zephyrix finally began to suspect that maybe, Just maybe, he had misjudged the situation. Entertainment, he asked. The consumption of enemies is a sacred ritual, Craxus explained helpfully. We will devour you slowly, so that your pain might honor our ancestors. Ah, Zephyrix said faintly. I see. No, you don't, Morrison said cheerfully. But you're about to. And that was when he opened his gear bag. Now there are rules about what kind of weapons you can bring on a diplomatic mission. Very specific rules, carefully negotiated by very serious people who spent a lot of time thinking about these things. Morrison had read those rules. He'd even followed them, technically speaking. The problem was that Morrison had what you might call a creative interpretation of weapons regulations. The first thing he pulled out looked like a standard plasma pistol. It wasn't. It was actually a military-grade particle beam weapon that had been designed to punch through tank armor. The second thing looked like a harmless scanner. It was actually a sonic disruptor capable of liquefying internal organs at 30 meters. Commander Morrison, Zephyrix said very carefully. What exactly are you doing? My job, Morrison replied, checking the charge on what appeared to be a flashlight, but was actually a portable photon torpedo launcher. You wanted to negotiate, right? Yes, but... Great. Negotiations work best when both sides respect each other. I fail to see how weapons will... And respect, Morrison continued, pulling out something that definitely hadn't been in any equipment manual. Comes from understanding exactly what the other guy is capable of. Warprime Craxus was watching this display with what Morrison assumed was amusement. Human, do you think your small weapons will save you? Probably not, Morrison admitted. But that's not really the point. Then what is the point? Morrison grinned. It was the same grin that had made hardened terrorists reconsider their life choices. The same grin that had caused 3 different species to add him to their lists of beings never to be encountered under any circumstances. The point, Morrison said, is how many of you I can take with me. And then he pulled out the really illegal stuff. The thing that Morrison produced from the bottom of his gear bag looked like a small, innocent cylinder about the size of a coffee cup. It had no obvious controls, no warning labels, and no indication of what it might do, which was exactly what made it so terrifying. What is that? Craxus demanded. This? Morrison held up the cylinder like he was showing off a family photo. This is a quantum destabilizer. Experimental model. Still working out the bugs. The arena had gone very, very quiet. Quantum destabilizer? Yeah. Basically, it destabilizes the quantum fields holding matter together in a localized area. Range is about, call it 5 kilometers. Give or take. You are bluffing. Am I? Morrison looked around the arena with the casual interest of someone considering a restaurant menu. Let's see. 5,000 warriors in here. Maybe another 10,000 in the surrounding sections of the ship. Yeah, this should just about cover everybody. Warprime Craxus took a step backward, which, for a being who had spent his entire life as the apex predator of his species, was a profoundly unsettling experience. That weapon is illegal under galactic convention. Oh, absolutely. Morrison agreed. Super illegal. Like War Crimes Tribunal illegal. Exile to a black hole illegal. But here's the thing about humans and illegal weapons. He paused for dramatic effect. We make them anyway. The silence in the arena was now complete. 5,000 of the galaxy's most feared warriors were staring at a single human, holding what might or might not be the most destructive personal weapon ever created, and trying to figure out if he was crazy enough to use it. The answer, of course, was yes. He absolutely was. Now, Morrison continued conversationally, Ambassador Zephyrix here has a peace proposal. I think you should listen to it. Under threat of annihilation? Under the possibility of mutual annihilation, Morrison corrected. Big difference. I'm not threatening you. I'm just explaining the situation. Which is that you can either negotiate in good faith with the ambassador here, or you can try to kill us and find out whether this thing actually works. Warprime Craxus was beginning to understand why humans had developed such an interesting reputation in such a short time. And if we refuse to negotiate? Morrison shrugged. Then we all find out together whether quantum destabilizers work as advertised. Could be educational. You would kill yourself to stop us? Buddy, Morrison said with the tone of someone explaining something to a particularly slow child. I'm human. We once had a guy who strapped himself to a nuclear bomb just to prove a point. Mutually assured destruction isn't a deterrent to us. It's a lifestyle choice. Ambassador Zephyrix was beginning to understand why Director Harrison had recommended Morrison for this mission. It wasn't because Morrison was diplomatic. It was because Morrison was completely, utterly insane, and sometimes insanity was exactly what diplomacy needed. Perhaps, Zephyrix said carefully, we could discuss this in a more civilized manner? War Prime Craxus was still staring at Morrison, who was now casually tossing the quantum destabilizer from hand to hand like it was a ball. Very well, speak your terms. Excellent, Zephyrix brightened immediately. The Galactic Council proposes an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of Korvaxi forces from the Tanari system. Unacceptable. Counter-proposal, Morrison said, still tossing the cylinder. You withdraw from Tanari space. We don't all become subatomic particles. Thoughts? This is coercion. This is negotiation, Morrison corrected. Coercion would be if I armed this thing and gave you 30 seconds to decide. This is me politely asking you to consider the ramifications of your current course of action. Craxus looked around the arena at his warriors, all of whom were watching the quantum destabilizer with the kind of attention usually reserved for venomous snakes. You cannot intimidate the Korvaxi collective. I'm not trying to intimidate anybody, Morrison replied. I'm just providing context for the negotiations. What he means, Zephyrix added helpfully, is that sometimes peace is in everyone's best interests. The Tanari system contains resources we require. And there are other systems with similar resources, Zephyrix pointed out. Uninhabited systems, where you wouldn't have to deal with the complications of genocide. Or, Morrison added, you could stick with the current plan and see what happens when I accidentally drop this thing. He fumbled the cylinder, caught it at the last second, and grinned apologetically. Sorry, Butterfingers. Several thousand Korvaxi warriors flinched simultaneously. What exactly are you proposing? Craxus asked. Simple trade agreement, Zephyrix said quickly. The Council provides you with mining rights to 3 uninhabited systems with similar resource profiles to Tanari. In exchange, you end the blockade and establish formal diplomatic relations. And if we refuse? Morrison looked thoughtful. Well, we could always settle this the traditional human way, which is single combat. You and me. Winner takes all. The arena erupted in what Morrison's translator rendered as excited chittering mixed with bloodlust. War Prime Craxus tilted his massive head. You would challenge me to personal combat? Sure. Why not? You're what, 3 times my size? Natural armor plating? Mandibles that could bite through steel? Should be a fair fight. Should be? Well, Morrison said, pulling out what looked like a completely normal combat knife. I do have a few advantages. Such as? I'm human. Morrison tested the edge of the blade with his thumb. We're really good at killing things that are bigger than us. This was the moment when War Prime Craxus began to seriously reconsider his species' approach to diplomacy. Because Morrison wasn't just confident, he was the kind of confident that came from having done this sort of thing before. Successfully. You have fought beings larger than yourself? Oh, constantly. Back on Earth, we have these things called bears. Polar bears can weigh about 1,500 pounds, have claws like knives, and can run faster than most humans. Want to know how many humans have killed polar bears with just a knife? How many? More than you'd think. Then there are the sharks, the tigers, the crocodiles. We've got a whole planet full of things that want to eat us, and we've been dealing with them for millennia. But I am not a mere beast. No, you're not, Morrison agreed. You're much more dangerous. But you know what? You're also predictable. Predictable? You're a warrior. You think like a warrior. You fight like a warrior. Me. Morrison's grin widened. I'm not a warrior. I'm a soldier. And soldiers cheat. Craxus was beginning to understand why the Galactic Council had managed to negotiate so many favorable treaties in the 4 decades since humans joined. What are your terms for this combat? Simple. If I win, you withdraw from Tanari space and sign the trade agreement. If you win, you get to eat us both and continue with your invasion. And the weapon? Morrison looked down at the quantum destabilizer, which he was still casually tossing. This? Dead man's switch. If my heart stops, it goes off automatically. Dead man's switch? Human invention. We figured out a long time ago that the best way to avoid getting killed is to make sure the other guy dies too if he succeeds. Ambassador Zephyrix was watching this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing either the greatest diplomatic breakthrough in galactic history or the most spectacular failure ever recorded. War Prime, he interjected. Surely we can reach an agreement without resorting to violence. The human has made a formal challenge, Craxus replied. Honor demands that I accept. See? Morrison said cheerfully. Sometimes diplomacy works perfectly. This is not diplomacy, Zephyrix protested. Sure it is. It's just diplomacy with more stabbing. The combat arena was cleared with remarkable efficiency, considering that it involved moving several thousand spectators who were all eager to watch their war prime dismember a human. Morrison used the time to make some final adjustments to his equipment. "Commander," Zephyrix said urgently, "you cannot possibly win this fight." "Probably not," Morrison agreed, checking the settings on what looked like a standard combat harness but was actually something considerably more sophisticated. "But winning isn't really the point." "Then what is the point?" "The point is making it so expensive that they'd rather negotiate than fight." "I don't understand." Morrison looked up from his equipment. "Ambassador, what's the most important rule of diplomacy? Always seek peaceful resolution?" "Nope. The most important rule is making sure the other guy knows exactly what it's going to cost him to say no." He stood up, checking the balance of his combat knife. It looked ordinary enough, but Zephyrix noticed that it seemed to hum very quietly, and the air around the blade seemed to shimmer slightly. "What is that weapon?" "Monofilament edge," Morrison explained casually. "Cuts through pretty much anything at the molecular level. Another one of those technically illegal but really useful human inventions." "Commander Morrison, I must protest this entire proceeding. This is supposed to be a diplomatic mission." "It is a diplomatic mission. I'm just conducting diplomacy by other means." War Prime Craxus entered the arena from the opposite side, and Morrison had to admit that the big crab was genuinely impressive. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator who had never encountered anything he couldn't kill, and his natural armor plating gleamed under the arena lights. "Human," Craxus called across the arena, "you may still surrender. I will make your death quick." "That's really thoughtful of you," Morrison replied, "but I think I'll pass." "Why do you smile? You're about to die." "Maybe. But you know what's funny about humans?" "What?" "We have this really annoying habit of not dying when we're supposed to." Morrison activated his combat harness, and suddenly he was moving a lot faster than any human should have been able to move. He crossed the arena in about 2 seconds, which gave Craxus just enough time to realize that maybe this wasn't going to be as easy as he'd thought. The fight lasted exactly 3 minutes and 27 seconds. Morrison knew this because his combat harness had a timer function, and because he'd made a bet with himself about how long it would take. It started with Craxus making the perfectly reasonable assumption that the best way to deal with a small, fast opponent was to catch him and crush him. He lunged forward with the kind of speed that had made the Corvaxi the terror of 3-star systems, mandibles spread wide to deliver a killing bite. Morrison wasn't there. This was because Morrison had done something that no reasonable person would attempt. He'd jumped straight up, used Craxus's own momentum to vault over the War Prime's head, and landed on his back. "What?" Craxus began, but Morrison was already moving. The monofilament knife sliced through 2 of the neural cables that controlled Craxus's left arm group with surgical precision. Not fatal, but definitely inconvenient. Craxus bucked like an angry bull, trying to dislodge his passenger, but Morrison had magnetic clamps in his boots and really good upper body strength. He held on, found another set of neural cables, and severed those too. "Impossible!" Craxus roared, spinning in circles and trying to reach the human on his back. "Improbable," Morrison corrected, slicing through a cluster of sensory organs. "There's a difference. The thing about human military technology is that it's designed by a species that expects to fight things bigger, stronger, and better armored than themselves. Human soldiers don't win fights by being tougher than their enemies. They win by being smarter, faster, and better equipped." Morrison's combat harness doubled his speed and tripled his strength. His knife could cut through anything short of a neutron star. His boots could stick to any surface. And his tactical computer was running a real-time analysis of Corvaxi anatomy, highlighting weak points in vital systems. It was, in other words, a profoundly unfair fight. "You know what your problem is?" Morrison asked conversationally, as he systematically disabled Craxus's weapon systems. "You think like a predator. Predators expect their prey to run away." He severed the neural connections to Craxus's primary weapon clusters. "But humans aren't prey. We're persistence hunters. We don't run away from things that want to eat us. Another cluster of sensory organs went dark. We figure out how to eat them first." That was when Morrison made his mistake. He got cocky, went for a particularly difficult neural cluster, and overextended himself. Craxus managed to grab him with one functional arm and slam him into the arena floor hard enough to crack the deck plating. Morrison rolled with the impact, came up bleeding but still functional, and grinned. "Okay," he said, wiping blood from his mouth. "Now we're having fun." What happened next was something that 5,000 Corvaxi warriors would talk about for the rest of their lives. Because Morrison didn't just continue fighting, he got faster. The combat harness had backup systems, and fail-safe systems. and emergency systems that activated when the primary systems detected potentially fatal damage to the wearer. Morrison's life signs had just triggered every single one of them. He became a blur of motion, moving faster than the arena's cameras could track. The monofilament knife left trails of light as it carved through Craxus's remaining functional systems with surgical precision. "Impossible!" Craxus bellowed, trying to track his opponent's movement. "No being can move that fast!" "You're right." Morrison's voice came from somewhere behind him. "But I'm not moving fast, I'm moving efficiently." Another set of weapon systems went offline. You see, that's the thing about humans. We don't just adapt to our environment. Morrison appeared briefly on Craxus's left flank, disabled a cluster of targeting sensors, and vanished again. We adapt our environment to us. The neural cluster controlling Craxus's defensive systems sparked and went dark. And when that doesn't work... Morrison materialized directly in front of Craxus, close enough that the War Prime could see his grin. We cheat. The quantum destabilizer, which Morrison had never actually activated, suddenly came online with a high-pitched whine that made everyone in the arena flinch. Craxus froze. "Did I mention," Morrison said conversationally, "that this thing has a proximity trigger? If anyone gets too close to me while I'm holding it, it goes off automatically." "You are bluffing." "Am I?" Morrison held up the cylinder, which was now glowing with a soft blue light that definitely hadn't been there before. "Want to find out?" War Prime Craxus, destroyer of worlds, crusher of enemies, bane of the weak, took a very large step backward. "I yield," he said. The silence in the arena was absolute. 5,000 Korvaxi warriors stared at their defeated War Prime, trying to process what they had just witnessed. A human, a single small human, had just beaten their greatest champion in single combat. Morrison deactivated the quantum destabilizer and clipped it back to his belt. "Good fight," he said cheerfully. "You nearly had me there for a minute." Craxus stared at him with compound eyes that reflected a mixture of disbelief, rage, and something that might have been respect. "How?" "Trade secret," Morrison replied, offering his hand in what was either a gesture of sportsmanship or a deeply inappropriate human custom. "Good match, though. You've got some serious moves." Ambassador Zephyric stepped forward, his crystalline structure practically vibrating with excitement. "War Prime Craxus, according to the terms of the combat, you have agreed to withdraw from Tanari space and consider our trade proposal." Craxus looked around the arena at his warriors, who were still staring at Morrison like he was some sort of impossible phenomenon. Several of them had started making sounds that the translator was rendering as confused chittering mixed with existential dread. "The human defeated me." "Technically," Morrison corrected. "I convinced you that continuing the fight wasn't cost-effective. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Oh, absolutely. If I'd actually defeated you, you'd be dead right now. Instead, you're just diplomatically inconvenienced." War Prime Craxus considered this for a long moment. The arena was still silent, waiting for his response. Finally, he straightened to his full imposing height and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast space. "The human has proven his worth in combat. His words carry the weight of victory. We will consider the crystalline proposal." Ambassador Zephyrix practically glowed with triumph. "Excellent. Shall we retire to more comfortable quarters to discuss the details?" "That would be acceptable." Morrison gathered up his equipment, pausing only to check that the quantum destabilizer was properly secured. "Ambassador, why don't you and the War Prime work out the details? I'll just stand over here and try not to accidentally destroy anything." The negotiations that followed were, by galactic standards, remarkably brief. Ambassador Zephyrix had spent decades preparing for this moment, crafting elegant arguments and sophisticated diplomatic strategies. As it turned out, none of that was necessary. War Prime Craxus listened to the trade proposal with the kind of attention usually reserved for surrender terms. Which, Morrison reflected, was essentially what they were. "The Council offers mining rights to the Kepler 442, Kepler 438, and Gliese 6 and 67C systems," Zephyrix explained, consulting his notes. "All three contain resource profiles similar to the Tanari system, but are currently uninhabited. And in exchange? Immediate withdrawal of Korvaxi forces from Tanari space, establishment of formal diplomatic relations, and a mutual non-aggression pact." Craxus looked across the negotiating table at Morrison, who was casually cleaning his fingernails with the monofilament knife. "And if we refuse? Then we try to work out a different arrangement," Zephyrix said diplomatically. "Or," Morrison added without looking up from his manicure, "we could have another chat about quantum physics." We accept the terms. Zephyrix blinked in surprise. Just like that? Just like that. But I had prepared extensive arguments about the economic benefits of peaceful coexistence. I have charts. Keep your charts, Crystalline. The human has made a more compelling argument. Morrison finally looked up. I did? You demonstrated that humans are capable of individual combat effectiveness previously unknown to our species. Oh, that. If one human can defeat a Corvaxi war prime, what might an army of humans accomplish? Morrison grinned. You really don't want to find out? No, we really do not. Ambassador Zephyrix was scribbling notes furiously. This is unprecedented. A complete diplomatic breakthrough achieved through aggressive negotiation? Morrison suggested. Violence, Craxus corrected. Honest, straightforward violence. We understand violence. We respect violence. Your crystalline words are pretty, but they mean nothing without the strength to back them up. An interesting perspective, Zephyrix mused. Though I still believe that reasoned discourse would have resulted in your consumption, Craxus interrupted. The human saved your life. I did? Morrison looked surprised. I was just doing my job. Your job is to threaten total annihilation? My job is to keep the ambassador alive. Everything else is just creative problem-solving. The formal signing ceremony was held aboard the Serene Harmony, partly because it was neutral ground and partly because Morrison had hinted that he'd rather not spend any more time than necessary aboard a ship full of beings who had recently been planning to eat him. War Prime Craxus arrived with a small honor guard, all of whom kept a respectful distance from Morrison. Word of the combat had apparently spread throughout the Corvaxi fleet with remarkable speed. I must admit, Zephyrix said as they waited for the final documents to be prepared, I'm curious about something. Speak. The quantum destabilizer. Was it actually armed during the combat? Morrison and Craxus looked at each other. There was a moment of what might charitably be called understanding. Does it matter? Morrison asked. I suppose not. The threat was real, Craxus said. That is what mattered. But was the weapon actually functional? Morrison pulled the cylinder from his belt and held it up to the light. It looked completely ordinary now. No glowing, no humming, no indication that it was anything more than an unusually expensive paperweight. Trade secret, he said finally. You never intended to use it, Craxus accused. I always intend to use whatever tools are necessary to complete the mission. Whether I actually have to use them depends on how reasonable everyone decides to be. And if we had called your bluff? Morrison's grin was sharp enough to cut steel. Who says I was bluffing? The signing ceremony proceeded without further incident. Ambassador Zephyrix had managed to achieve something that 3 years of traditional diplomacy had failed to accomplish. A complete Corvaxi withdrawal from Tenari space and the establishment of formal trade relations. This will be remembered as one of the great diplomatic triumphs in galactic history, Zephyrix said, as they watched the Corvaxi fleet begin its withdrawal. Probably, Morrison agreed. Though I'm not sure it counts as diplomacy if someone gets beaten up. Combat diplomacy? Aggressive negotiations? Mutually assured discourse? They settled on unconventional problem-solving for the official report. The journey back to Council space was considerably more relaxed than the outbound trip. Ambassador Zephyrix spent most of his time composing what he was convinced would be the most important diplomatic memoir in galactic history. Morrison spent most of his time sleeping off the after-effects of combat stimulants and quantum-enhanced reflexes. Commander, Zephyrix said during one of their debriefing sessions, I have to ask, was any of what you did actually legal? Morrison considered this carefully. Define legal. Permitted under galactic law. Well, the combat was legal. Single combat is a recognized form of dispute resolution under Corvaxi law. And the weapons? The knife was technically within regulations. Monofilament edges aren't specifically prohibited for personal defense weapons. And the quantum destabilizer? Ah, Morrison scratched his head. That one's a bit more complicated. How complicated? Well, quantum destabilizers are illegal to manufacture, illegal to possess, illegal to transport, and definitely illegal to threaten people with. So what you did was completely against galactic law? Not exactly. Then what exactly? Morrison grinned. The thing is, Ambassador, you have to actually have a quantum destabilizer for it to be illegal to have a quantum destabilizer. Zephyrix stared at him. You mean... I mean that humans have gotten really good at making things that look like other things. You're saying it was fake? I'm saying that the definition of fake depends a lot on your perspective and your level of technical expertise. But you threatened to use it. I threatened to find out whether it would work. Big difference. Is there a difference? Sure, one's a bluff and the other is a really dangerous experiment. Ambassador Zephyrix was quiet for a long moment. Commander Morrison, are you telling me that you ended a war with a weapon that might not have existed? I ended a war by making it clear that continuing the war would be more expensive than stopping it. The specific details of the cost-benefit analysis are less important than the general principle. That's insane. No, that's human. The reception at Council headquarters was everything Ambassador Zephyrix had hoped for and everything Morrison had dreaded. Formal ceremonies, lengthy speeches, and enough political glad-handing to choke a small planet. Director Harrison pulled Morrison aside during the celebration. So, how did it go? Pretty standard diplomatic mission, really. Some light negotiation, a bit of cross-cultural exchange, one formal combat to the death. Combat to the death? Well, combat to the yield. Important distinction. And the quantum destabilizer? Morrison looked around to make sure no one was listening, then leaned in close. You want to know a secret? Always. There's no such thing as a portable quantum destabilizer. Harrison stared at him. What? The physics don't work. Too much energy required, no way to contain the reaction, and the power source alone would weigh about 15 tons. Then what was that thing you were carrying? Emergency beacon. Military surplus. I rigged it with a light and a sound generator. You threatened to destroy an entire fleet with an emergency beacon? I threatened to find out what would happen if I activated an unknown piece of human technology. The Korvaxi drew their own conclusions. Harrison was quiet for a moment. Morrison, you realize you just committed about 47 different violations of galactic law? Did I? I mean, technically, I never actually lied about anything. I said it was a quantum destabilizer, and it was just not a functional one. I said it had a dead man's switch, and it did. It was programmed to send a distress signal if my vital signs flatlined. I said it would destabilize quantum fields in a 5-kilometer radius, and it would, by sending out a really annoying beeping sound that would definitely destabilize anyone trying to concentrate. That's the most creative interpretation of the truth I've ever heard. Thank you. I've been working on it. And if they'd called your bluff? Morrison's expression turned serious. Then I would have found another way. That's what humans do, Director. We don't give up just because the odds are bad. Even when the odds are impossible? Especially then. Impossible just means nobody's figured out how to do it yet. 3 months later, the Tanari Accords, as they came to be known, were being hailed as the most successful diplomatic initiative in recent galactic history. The Korvaxi had not only withdrawn from Tanari space, but had become active participants in galactic trade, contributing their military expertise to Council security operations in exchange for continued access to the uninhabited mining systems. War Prime Craxus had personally requested that any future negotiations involving humans include Morrison as a cultural advisor. He'd also started what could only be described as a fan club among young Korvaxi warriors, who were apparently fascinated by human combat techniques. Ambassador Zephyrix had been promoted to senior ambassador and was now heading up the Council's new, unconventional diplomacy division. His first official act had been to recommend Morrison for a commendation for services to galactic peace. Morrison had politely declined the commendation and requested a transfer to somewhere quiet where nothing interesting ever happens. He was currently on his way to the Andromeda sector, which was supposedly the most boring posting in the galaxy. Think you'll like it out there? Director Harrison asked as they watched Morrison's transport ship prepare for departure. God, I hope so, Morrison replied. I could use some peace and quiet. What are the odds that you'll find it? Morrison considered this. Well, humans have a saying about peace and quiet. Which is? It's overrated. Harrison laughed. Think you'll miss the excitement? Are you kidding? I'm looking forward to a nice, normal assignment where the biggest problem is paperwork and the most dangerous thing I have to deal with is cafeteria food. And if something interesting does happen? Morrison grinned. Then I guess the universe will find out what happens when you give a bored human too much time to think. The transport ship departed on schedule, carrying Morrison toward what everyone hoped would be a quiet, uneventful tour of duty in the most peaceful sector of the galaxy. 3 weeks later, Director Harrison received a priority message from the Andromeda sector. It was very short. Request immediate reinforcements. Morrison has declared war on the local wildlife. Situation escalating rapidly. Please advise on appropriate response to human civilian claiming hunting season on sentient gas clouds. Also, Need guidance on whether Morrison's proposal to domesticate the space whales constitutes a first contact scenario or a wildlife protection violation. Harrison read the message twice, then poured himself a drink. Yep, he said to no one in particular. That sounds about right. Epilogue. The official report on the Tanari crisis was filed under Successful Diplomatic Resolution and became required reading at the Galactic Diplomatic Academy. A heavily edited version anyway. The parts about quantum destabilizers, illegal weapons modifications, and the creative interpretation of galactic law were classified at a level that required 3 different species to sign off on access. The real lesson of the Tanari crisis, however, was much simpler. Sometimes the best way to achieve peace is to make war too expensive to contemplate. And sometimes the most effective diplomat is the one who isn't actually a diplomat at all. But the most important lesson was this. Never, ever underestimate a human with a gear bag and a questionable understanding of what constitutes appropriate force. Because humans, as the galaxy was slowly learning, had a very special talent for turning impossible situations into merely improbable ones. And improbable, as any human could tell you, was just another word for challenging. 3 years later, when the crystalline hegemony was facing a similar crisis with the sulfur-based consortium of Rigel 7, Ambassador Zephyrix didn't hesitate. He sent a message to the Andromeda sector. Need Morrison. Situation requires unconventional problem-solving. The reply came back 6 hours later. Morrison currently busy establishing diplomatic relations with sentient asteroids. We'll send Lieutenant Wilson instead. Warning. Wilson once ended a bar fight by convincing both sides to form a jazz band. Consider yourselves warned. And that was how the galaxy learned that Morrison wasn't unique among humans. He was just the first one they'd met. The rest, as they say, is history. Very, very interesting history. The end.
Listen, I've been working IT support for the Galactic Network Administration for about 15 standard cycles now, and I thought I'd seen everything. Corrupted quantum databases? Tuesday. Sentient viruses demanding workers' rights? Wednesday. An entire species accidentally deleting themselves from existence because they couldn't figure out how to use version control? That was last Thursday, and honestly, we're still dealing with the paperwork. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the day I stumbled across file GN7749 Omega Restricted No, really don't touch this one. Text. Yeah, that's right. A TXT file. In the year 2387, when we've got neural link databases that can store the collective consciousness of entire civilizations, when we've got quantum storage matrices that exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously, when we've got data formats so advanced they make reality itself question its own existence. Someone uploaded a plain text file, and somehow, this little TXT file had more security clearance than the Emperor's personal porn collection. My name's David Sterling, by the way. I'm what you might call a cultural liaison specialist, which is corporate speak for the guy who explains why humans are like that. It's a surprisingly lucrative career path, considering we've spent the last 2 centuries confusing the hell out of everyone else in the galaxy. The morning this all started, I was sitting in my glorified cubicle on Station Harmony 7, drinking what the cafeteria generously called coffee, but which I'm pretty sure was actually liquid existential dread with caffeine additives. My workstation was pinging with the usual requests. Sterling, the Zephyrian delegation is asking why humans insist on shaking hands instead of the traditional greeting of ritual combat to the death. Sterling, the Christine Empire wants to know if Netflix and chill is actually a declaration of war. Sterling, there's been another incident involving humans and the words "hold my beer." You know, the usual Tuesday morning stuff. That's when my supervisor, Korvax, a 6-foot-tall insectoid who always looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else, scuttled over to my desk with what I can only describe as the digital equivalent of a live grenade. "Sterling," he said, his vocal sacs inflating with what I'd learned to recognize as extreme nervousness. "We have a
situation." I looked up from my screen, where I'd been drafting yet another memo titled, "Why Humans Consider, Because I Felt Like It, a Valid Reason for Major Life Decisions." What kind of situation? Scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is someone tried to download the internet, and 10 is the humans discovered something new and decided to weaponize it. Korvax's compound eyes somehow managed to convey the expression of someone who'd just been asked to explain quantum physics to a particularly dense rock. 11. 11? The Galactic Security Council has been trying to access a file for the past 3 cycles. It's been classified at the highest possible security level, above even the location of the universal reset button. I blinked. There's a universal reset button? Focus, Sterling. The file it's written in English. Now you have to understand something about the galactic community. We've got universal translators that can convert any language into any other language instantaneously. We've got AI systems that can learn and understand new languages in nanoseconds. We've got telepathic species that communicate through interpretive dance, and we somehow figured out how to subtitle that. But for some reason this one file, completely untranslatable. What do you mean untranslatable? I asked. Korvax pulled up a holographic display showing the file in question. It was a simple text document, but the security warning surrounding it looked like someone had wrapped it in digital barbed wire and then set the barbed wire on fire. Every time our translation systems try to process it, He paused, his antenna twitching nervously. They start laughing. Laughing? Hysterically. The advanced linguistics AI spent 6 hours yesterday just repeating the phrase, "Oh, that's rich," over and over. The quantum translation matrix achieved sentience just so it could tell us to go ask the humans about it before immediately deleting itself. I stared at the screen. The file was small, maybe a few paragraphs at most. But it was surrounded by more security protocols than a neutron star recipe. Who uploaded it? Unknown. It appeared in the network 3 cycles ago, automatically assigned maximum security clearance. Every attempt to trace its origin has resulted in the investigating AI either having what can only be described as a nervous breakdown or converting to philosophy. And they want me to read it. You're the only human with appropriate clearance currently available. I looked at the file again. Its innocuous appearance was somehow more terrifying than if it had been actively on fire and screaming. What makes you think I can handle it if your advanced AI systems can't? Korvax's vocal sacs deflated slightly. Because, Sterling, you're human. And in our experience, humans have a remarkable ability to read the most horrifying things and just shrug. He wasn't wrong. I'd read the Galactic Council's Emergency Protocols Manual for fun. Twice. Fine, I said, taking what I hoped wouldn't be my last sip of existential dread. But I want a raise. Done. And a new beverage dispenser. Sterling, you know I can't. Korvax, I'm about to read a file that made an AI delete itself. I want a beverage dispenser that doesn't taste like the void between stars. He made a chittering sound with his mandibles that I'd learned was the insectoid equivalent of a sigh. Fine, but only if you survive. Deal. The process of accessing the file required no fewer than 17 different security checks, including a retinal scan, a DNA sample, a psychological evaluation, and for some reason a brief essay on why I thought efficiency was overrated. By the time I was finally granted access, half the station's security staff had gathered around my workstation like I was about to perform live surgery. You know, I said to nobody in particular, this is exactly the kind of thing that makes other species think we're insane. Are you not? Asked Zix, a crystalline being whose species communicated through light patterns. The translator rendered it as a genuine question. Jury's still out, I admitted. The file opened, and I started laughing. Not a little chuckle, mind you. I'm talking about the kind of deep, belly-shaking laughter that makes your sides hurt and your eyes water. The kind of laughter that makes everyone around you deeply concerned for your mental health. The security team stepped back. Korvax's antennae went completely flat against his head. Sterling? He asked carefully. Are you experiencing a psychotic break? No, I gasped between laughs. This is perfect. Oh God, this is absolutely perfect. I wiped tears from my eyes and looked around at the assembled crowd of concerned alien faces. You want to know why your translation systems can't handle this file? They all nodded. Because it's not meant to be translated. It's an instruction manual. An instruction manual for what? Korvax asked, though his tone suggested he really didn't want to know. I grinned. For humans. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when everyone in the room simultaneously realizes they've made a terrible mistake, but can't quite figure out what that mistake was. What do you mean? Zix's light patterns were flickering and what I'd learned was the crystalline equivalent of nervous laughter. I mean, I said, pulling up the file on the main display. This is a guide written by humans, for humans, about how to deal with alien species. And it's basically a comedy routine. The file read, Classified Human Survival Guide, Dealing with Alien Species, version 3.7. The Why Are They Like This edition. Section 1. General Principles. Rule number 1. When in doubt, be polite but weird. But aliens expect humans to be incomprehensible, so lean into it. If they ask you to explain human behavior, respond with something like, we're working on it, or That's actually a feature, not a bug. Rule number 2. If an alien species has more than 4 eyes, they're probably overanalyzing everything. Speak in vague metaphors and watch them tie themselves in knots trying to understand the deeper meaning. Rule number 3. Never admit that we figured out faster than light travel by accident while trying to make a better toaster. Let them think we're secretly geniuses. Rule number 4. If they ask about Earth customs, make something up. They'll never know the difference, and it's fun to watch them try to incorporate traditional human sock worship into their diplomatic protocols. Section 2. Species-specific protocols. The Zephyrians, insectoid, hierarchical, obsessed with efficiency, constantly rearrange things for no reason. When they ask why, explain that chaos is the natural state of human organization. Refer to your work as beautiful disasters, and insist that inefficiency is an art form. If they start clicking their mandibles rapidly, they're either laughing or having a nervous breakdown. Either way, you're winning. The Christine Empire, silicon-based, communicates through light, extremely logical. Respond to their logical arguments with human sayings like, well, that's life, or it is what it is. When they ask for clarification, just shrug and say, you had to be there. If they start flickering rapidly, they're either confused or about to achieve enlightenment. Both are equally entertaining. The quantum collective, energy beings, exist in multiple dimensions, think they're superior to everyone. Pretend you can see their aura and comment on how it's looking a little dim today. Use the phrase quantum entanglement in completely inappropriate contexts. If they claim to exist in 17 dimensions, nod knowingly and say, yeah, but the 18th dimension is where the real action is. Section 3. Emergency protocols. If you're ever in a situation where you need to confuse an alien species quickly, start explaining human mating rituals. They'll either run away or become so fascinated they forget what they were originally asking about. Mention that humans consider awkward silence a form of communication. Then stop talking entirely. Begin a story with, so there I was, minding my own business, and never finish it. Explain that humans have a holiday where they carve faces into vegetables and leave them outside to rot. When they ask why, tell them it's for the spirits. If all else fails, start singing. Humans are the only species that makes music for literally no reason, and it terrifies everyone else. Section 4. Advanced techniques. For diplomatic situations, always bring snacks. Aliens are fascinated by human food, and it's hard to be threatening while eating cheese and crackers. If negotiations stall, suggest a human solution to the problem. They'll assume it's brilliant and dangerous in equal measure. End every meeting with, well, that could have gone worse. It implies you're used to disasters, which is both accurate and intimidating. Section 5. Things to never admit. That we named our planet Dirt and our moon Moon because we literally couldn't think of anything better. That most human technological advancement happened because someone was bored. That we domesticated wolves by basically just being really, really persistent. That we figured out agriculture by accident and then spent the next 10,000 years trying to perfect it. That our greatest military strategy is, hold my beer and watch this. Final note. Remember, the goal isn't to be understood. It's to be so confusing that they stop asking questions. Humans have survived this long not because we're the smartest, strongest, or most advanced species, but because we're so unpredictable that nobody knows how to deal with us. Use this power wisely. Or don't. You're human. You'll probably do whatever you want anyway. The silence in the room was deafening. I could practically hear the collective sound of alien minds trying to process what they'd just learned. Finally, Korvac spoke. This is how you see us? Well, I said. It's not wrong, is it? Zix's light patterns had gone completely still. You think we're easy to manipulate? I think, I said carefully, that every species has its quirks, and humans are really, really good at adaptation. We've been confusing each other for millennia. Confusing you guys is just an extension of that. But this suggests that human behavior is calculated, one of the security officers said. She was a Mantari, a species known for their logical approach to everything. Not calculated, I corrected. Intuitive. We don't plan to be confusing, we just are. And somewhere along the way someone figured out how to turn that into a feature instead of a bug. Korvax's antenna twitched. The file. It's been causing massive security concerns across the galaxy. The Galactic Council has been in emergency session for 3 cycles. Because they finally realized that humans have been winging it this whole time? Because they realized that humans have been successfully winging it this whole time? I sat back in my chair. So what happens now? Now, Korvax said, his vocal sacs inflating with what I was pretty sure was resignation. "We have to figure out how to deal with the fact that the most unpredictable species in the galaxy has been operating on pure instinct, and somehow managed to become one of the most influential civilizations in galactic history. And that's bad because it means everything we thought we knew about strategy, planning, and logical decision-making is apparently optional." I grinned. "Welcome to being human." Over the next few hours, word spread throughout the station, then throughout the sector, then throughout the galaxy. The file that had been locked away with maximum security clearance wasn't a weapon, or a secret technology, or a doomsday device. It was a comedy routine that accidentally revealed the greatest secret in galactic history. Humans weren't mysterious because we were advanced. We were mysterious because we were making it up as we went along, and somehow that was working. The reactions were varied. The Zephyrians immediately called an emergency session of their Efficiency Council to discuss how to incorporate controlled chaos into their organizational structure. The Christine Empire spent 3 days trying to logically analyze the concept of winging it, before their philosophers achieved collective enlightenment and started a new religion based on the principle of constructive confusion. The Quantum Collective claimed they'd always known humans were operating on pure instinct, but their dimensional readings suggested they were lying. And the Galactic Council? They declared an emergency session to discuss the human problem. I found myself summoned to testify before the full council, which was both terrifying and oddly flattering. The council chamber was a massive amphitheater that could hold representatives from over 1,000 species. And as I walked to the witness podium, I could feel thousands of eyes, sensors, and other sensory organs focused on me. The chief counselor, a being so ancient and wise that his species had forgotten what they originally looked like, spoke first. "David Sterling of Earth." His voice echoed through the chamber. "You stand before this council to explain the document that has caused what can only be described as a galactic existential crisis." "Thank you, Your Honor," I said, falling back on courtroom etiquette because nobody had bothered to brief me on proper council protocol. Though I should point out that we didn't cause the crisis, we just finally explained it. A ripple of something went through the assembled delegates. I couldn't tell if it was laughter, horror, or the sound of 1,000 species simultaneously having nervous breakdowns. "The document suggests," continued the chief counselor, "that human behavior is not the result of advanced planning or superior intellect, but rather improvisation." "That's correct. And this improvisation has allowed your species to become a major galactic power." "Also correct. How?" I thought about it for a moment. "Well, sir, it's like this. Most species seem to approach problems by analyzing them, forming committees, running simulations, and then implementing carefully planned solutions. Humans approach problems by trying stuff until something works. And this is effective?" "Apparently. I mean, we're here, aren't we?" The delegate from the Rigelian Confederacy, a species known for their 1,000-year planning cycles, stood up. "But how do you make long-term decisions? How do you plan for the future?" "We don't," I said simply. "We make short-term decisions that seem reasonable at the time and hope they work out. When they don't, we improvise something new." "But that's insane." "Is it?" I asked. "How's that 1,000-year plan working out for you?" The Rigelian delegate sat down abruptly. I later learned that their current 1,000-year plan was already 300 years behind schedule. Another delegate stood up, this one from the hegemony of precision, a species that had eliminated uncertainty from their entire civilization. "Surely you must have some system, some method for making decisions?" "We do," I said. "We call it seeing what happens." "That's not a system." "Sure it is. It's a system based on the assumption that the future is unpredictable. So the best strategy is to remain flexible and adapt as needed." The delegate from the Collective of Eternal Wisdom, a hive mind that had been planning their next move for the past millennium, spoke up. "But how do you coordinate? How do you ensure everyone is working toward the same goal?" "We don't," I said. "We assume everyone is working toward their own goals, and we try to make sure those goals don't conflict too much. When they do conflict, we argue about it until someone gets tired and compromises." "And this works?" "We haven't destroyed ourselves yet." The chief counselor leaned forward. "Mr. Sterling, are you suggesting that the human approach to civilization is superior?" "No," I said. "I'm suggesting that it's different, and that difference has been effective for us. Whether it's superior depends on what you're trying to accomplish." "And what are humans trying to accomplish?" I thought about it. Honestly, We're mostly just trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing. We're kind of making it up as we go along and hoping it works out. And if it doesn't work out, then we'll try something else. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when an entire galactic civilization realizes that their most basic assumptions about how things work might be completely wrong. Finally, the chief counselor spoke again. Mr. Sterling, this council has spent 3 cycles debating how to respond to this revelation. We have considered everything from quarantining your species to studying you as a unique phenomenon. But I believe your testimony has clarified something important. What's that, sir? That you're not trying to confuse us. You're just being yourselves. Pretty much. And being yourselves involves making decisions based on insufficient information, adapting to unexpected circumstances, and generally proceeding without a clear plan. That's a fair summary. And this approach has somehow resulted in your species becoming a major galactic power. I know it sounds crazy when you put it like that. The chief counselor was quiet for a long moment. Then, incredibly, he began to laugh. It was a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and it was contagious. Within minutes, the entire council chamber was filled with the sounds of 1,000 species laughing in their own unique ways. Mr. Sterling, the chief counselor said when the laughter died down, I believe this council owes your species an apology. For what? For assuming you were mysterious. For assuming you had some grand plan that we simply couldn't understand. For assuming that your unpredictability was a strategy rather than simply who you are. I shrugged. No harm done. Though I should point out that some of us do have plans. They just don't usually work out the way we expect. Indeed, this council hereby declares that the human approach to civilization, while unconventional, is not a threat to galactic stability. In fact, it may be exactly what galactic civilization needs. How so? Because Mr. Sterling, the rest of us have been so busy planning and analyzing and optimizing that we've forgotten how to adapt. We've become so focused on avoiding mistakes that we've stopped taking risks. We've become so efficient that we've forgotten how to be creative. And humans are creative? Humans are the only species that has ever looked at a problem and said, I wonder what would happen if we tried this completely ridiculous solution, and then actually tried it. And then, when it worked, acted like it was perfectly reasonable. That does sound like us. The document that caused this crisis wasn't a security threat, it was a revelation. It showed us that there's another way to approach existence. A way that doesn't require perfect information or optimal solutions. A way that embraces uncertainty and finds opportunity in chaos. So what happens now? The chief counselor smiled. At least, I think it was a smile. It was hard to tell with a being that looked like a cross between a tree and a very dignified mushroom. Now, Mr. Sterling, we learn. We learn that efficiency isn't always the answer. We learn that plans are just suggestions. We learn that sometimes the best solution is to try something and see what happens. And if it doesn't work, then we try something else, just like humans do. I left the council chamber that day with a new understanding of my species' place in the galaxy. We weren't the smartest, strongest, or most advanced civilization. We were the most adaptable. We were the species that had turned uncertainty into a strength, confusion into a tool, and chaos into a way of life. And somehow that was enough. The file that had caused so much concern was declassified and made available to the entire galaxy. It became required reading in xenopsychology courses, and was translated into over 1,000 languages. Though the translations always included a note that it was best understood in the original context of human bewilderment. As for me, I got my raise, my new beverage dispenser, and a promotion to Chief Human Explainer for the Galactic Council. My job description is literally, help everyone else understand why humans are like that. It's the best job in the galaxy. Because at the end of the day, being human isn't about having all the answers. It's about being comfortable with the questions. It's about looking at an impossible situation and saying, hold my beer, before diving in head first. It's about making mistakes, learning from them, and then making completely different mistakes the next time. It's about being adaptable, creative, and just a little bit crazy. And apparently that's exactly what the galaxy needed. Who would have thought? Epilogue, 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office, with a window and everything, when Korvax stopped by with a report. Sterling, he said, I thought you should know. 3 more species have officially adopted constructive confusion as a governing principle. The Efficiency Council has disbanded itself in favor of a new organization called the Department of Productive Chaos. And the Quantum Collective has started a philosophy called embracing the 18th dimension. What's the 18th dimension? According to them, it's the dimension where you stop worrying about how many dimensions there are, and just accept that existence is weird. I grinned. Sounds about right. There's more. The Galactic Council has established a new department, the Office of Adaptive Solutions. They want humans to staff it. What do we do in the Office of Adaptive Solutions? Apparently, our job is to look at problems that other species have been trying to solve for decades and suggest completely ridiculous solutions that might actually work. That sounds suspiciously like what we've been doing all along. That's what they're counting on. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the stars. Somewhere out there, thousands of species were trying to figure out how to be more like humans. They were learning to embrace uncertainty, to find opportunity in chaos, to make decisions based on insufficient information and adapt as needed. It was probably going to be a disaster, but it was going to be an interesting disaster. And really, what more could you ask for? After all, we're only human. End of file.